On Truth-Telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 26. Remnants. I have been conscious for quite some time that there are many personal developments and incidents in my life and, in particular, my later life that, not adding anything important to what I have already looked at in myself, and not dealing expressly with myself as a truth-teller or as one in contact with other truth-tellers, are best passed over in silence. Or if a word is needed even in this area, it should only be that I continued to live rough, independent, alone, and sometimes too much alone. Just as it had been in my earliest teenage years, there was a great thorn in my side. It was not being able to find that spiritual mate who, as implacable desire and imagination would have it, bore all manner of female charms. With a few exceptions, whoever attracted me physically had nothing of the spiritual that excited me and often was one I didn't know how to approach or else had but a brief relationship with before being rejected. Nothing inflicted upon me a stronger sense of insecurity and inadequacy than being rejected by a woman. Yet that part of my heart that was more sexual organ than I realized was so large and so much a part of my head, as studious observer of the situation, that, along with my absolute inability to feign a contrary attitude or disposition, I was doomed to discourage all who first fancied and favored me. And it is with no doubt a greater discouragement that, time and time again, I recoiled back into myself, licking my spiritual wounds and dreaming of some vague conquest or victory whereby none could refuse me. Why re you looking so glum? I just hate the thought that such beautiful boys could be so malicious. What on earth are you talking about? Whispering back and forth in class. Smirks on their faces. As if I were just a doddering old fool who couldn't contribute the slightest to their knowledge. But what about the secret or half-submerged enmity I bore towards the professional world? Apart from making poor Carl Ridd squirm in class and accuse me of disrupting it by asking too many pointed questions, and apart from a few skirmishes with other professors, there was only one incident during that first period of my studies where I came close to showing an overt lack of respect. In truth, it was at the tail end of this period. I was 33 and going through a period of general discouragement. What followed was my first genuine attempt to go off in a professional direction. Of course I eliminate cab driving and construction work from consideration because, apart from the usual criteria by which to distinguish professional from non-professional, and apart from never having made any special moves in these areas, no great show of getting along with other people is required, that famous collegiality or team spirit so much in demand. On the other hand, some kind of show is required to get in view as a bona fide playwright. With the conjuncture of having received my BA and being thoroughly discouraged by my writing efforts, I took it into my head that I should become a teacher. I went so far as to apply to the education department of the university to take the required one-year training program. Before my scheduled interviews with a couple of representatives from the department, I heard some talk about this program from other students and it gave me the distinct impression it was intellectually stultifying. The details are no longer with me but they disturbed me enough that I couldn't help but bring them up during the interview process. Both of the officials I spoke to took note of what I had to say not as a misguided conception of the department, but as an objection to my character and to my suitability for the program. With one it took the form of bringing up the matter of my having dropped out of high school. "How do we know you won't do it again?" he said. The other took umbrage when things became a bit heated and argumentative. "Well, I certainly wouldn't want you to teach my child," she said. "Nor mine were she still of that age. It's not by continually challenging and arguing with people that one is going to make progress. We all live in this world and all have to respect the rights and feelings of others if we want ours respected." "You're perfectly right, Theo. Still, there's some principle he's hit on, don't you think? I mean, if the truth about the department was being ignored by these two representatives, then surely there's a reason to be critical." He wasn't being critical. He was being disrespectful. Surely you wouldn't want someone coming here, a teacher, student, or whatever, who started off by listing the department's shortcomings. But wouldn't you agree it's usually how people proceed in these matters? For example, if the two boys that complained about me, by the way, the anecdotes I tell in class are experiences by which I try to illustrate the concept of Lebenswelt. I'm fascinated but get to the point. Well, if they'd come to me with their complaint instead of rushing to you, it would have been so much better. Perhaps being judged disrespectful while thinking oneself merely critical turns on different valuations that grade off on one side towards falsehood and on the other towards constituting an individual freedom that takes itself to be its own rule and measure. Ah, there it is. There's the danger. I couldn't have said it better. He's saying it in the name of truth-telling. And I'm saying it in the name of all the terrors and tyrannies that have afflicted this world. Perhaps then. What perhaps? The two sort of merge. What are you saying? There may be a complicity between the two. What two? Fear of the truth and taking it as one's right and privilege to say it. Andrew, you're suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. That isn't a very good way to meet my argument. It's not your argument, that's the trouble. Is there something like the Stockholm Syndrome that afflicts people who belong to a system? It would be a mild form, of course, but still potent enough to make its often highly privileged captive sympathetic to a standardized unwritten policy of not rocking the boat. Even in the systems where truth itself is featured as a paramount value, the not rocking the boat policy tends to win out when there is a question of choosing between certain truths and it. I'm sorry, Andrew. Please, forgive me. Throughout my life, I have never met anyone who admitted that the good living they made and the honored position they held had any bearing upon their capacity to be objective about the system that provided them with these. I don't think I would be far wrong in seeing in this strange absence of commentary a willed professional blindness that is one with a subtle and ever-present element of fear. An element that springs up from something irreducibly inhuman and even inhumane about the system that bears upon collective interests and their ultimately overruling private ones. Andrew, one of the things that's always ticked me off is to hear people who, not having done much, criticize those who have for making a few necessary and minor, if this is the right word, compromises. Blocked from going on as a university student. Blocked from undertaking a career as a teacher. Blocked from making any progress as a playwright. What a lucky thing for me there was the bosom of my family. First of all, my mother. What a spirit, so appraised to her son, so encouraging, so supportive, so unflagging in her love and devotion over 50 years. To think of how I undervalued her friendship in spite of my best intentions. Such is the way when someone or something is easy, accessible, always around, all too familiar, and inordinately tolerant of one's whims and ugly moods. How much more difficult it would have been if not for that one person who took an exceptional interest in my life and who believed in me as someone driven towards the heights. And this she took on faith from me because there was little in her background, interests, or inclinations that was congenial to the high-altitude flight that, during her lifetime, was always more envisioned by me than visible to anyone else. I'm looking for it, Andrew. I can't see it. I can't detect this high-altitude flight. Oh, wait. There's something up there. I think it's his mother. Yes, she's looking down from heaven and wondering why he hasn't left the ground yet. My very clever and level-headed oldest sister. Always the welcome mat put out for me. Always an attentive and patient ear despite her numerous activities. And the same could be said of Sharon, my second oldest sister, when she was healthy and well, or at least appeared to be so. And the same of my brother, more or less, until we became estranged. But is this estrangement a matter to go into when all it gives evidence of is, apart from my brother's troubled state of mind, my volatile temper and capacity for violence? Have I not laid this out well enough already and indicated that it was a trait even in my later years? Perhaps the only observation worth anything at this point is that I was far from suffering a bad conscience about it. Oh, listen to this, Andrew. Truth-telling is fine when it's a matter of generalities, but when it comes to a matter of conscience, when it comes to a matter of not having one, when it comes to a matter of squaring that with violence, then it's a different story. Well, think of what it is to be continuously assaulted with a point of view that comes from someone who has effectively cut you off from the rest of the world. Yes, Anne. That offers you no respite whatever while setting itself up as the true measure of things. Perhaps. That comes with a load of, I was going to say shit but I'll say self-criticism that effectively stops short precisely where outside criticism would come in. It seems to me. I don't know what more I can say to you, Andrew, to convince you have to immunize yourself against this fellow's anti-truth, anti-professional, anti-law and order propaganda. Despite numerous setbacks, I kept on with my playwriting, becoming even more marginal and isolated than I had hitherto been. Amidst the most discouraging signs and lack of outside interest, I was still bent on writing the one great masterpiece that would redeem all. But nothing of the sort materialized, and every single script I wrote eventually ended up in the garbage. The best I can say is that I read a great number of masterpieces over the next few years, plays, novels, short stories, and some philosophical works. Even if you have nothing to say on the matter, at least keep up your spirits. Don't resign yourself to being bullied. On Truthtelling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 27. Nietzsche. Why it took so long I don't know, but I finally came to him. The one thinker who consistently inspired me, heartened me, supplied me with numerous insights into myself and others. The one thinker who, as Emerson puts it in a more general way, had already expressed many thoughts that I myself had but only skirted or played around the edges of. Expressed them is too weak a way of putting it. He expounded on them at length and with an audacity sans parallel. And what was his principal target? Philosophy itself. The whole Western tradition of philosophical thought. Was it possible to imagine anyone taking on single-handedly a greater foe? Or at least taking it on in such a confrontational, provocative, menacing, wide-sweeping, and absolutely uncompromising way? To make of the great truth-tellers inveterate liars in their will to stand truth naked and unveiled before all, was this itself a truth too rude to go unpunished? It is difficult to overestimate the impact of a mind that appears to be one's own but more powerful, magnifying, penetrating, and wide-ranging. The best way to put it is that, even at the time of my greatest disillusionment and uncertainty, coming into full contact with Nietzsche's thought made any abandonment of my highest hope virtually impossible. Indeed, I know your danger. But by my love and hope I beseech you, do not throw away your love and hope. You still feel noble, and the others too feel your nobility, though they bear you a grudge and send you evil glances. Know that the nobleman stands in everybody's way. The nobleman stands in the way of the good too, and even if they call him one of the good, they thus want to do away with him. The nobleman wants to create something new and a new virtue. The good want the old, and that the old be preserved. But this is not the danger of the nobleman, that he might become one of the good, but a churl, a mocker, a destroyer. Alas, I knew noble men who lost their highest hope. Then they slandered all high hopes. Then they lived impudently in brief pleasures and barely cast their goals beyond the day. Spirit too is lust, so they said. Then the wings of their spirit broke, and now their spirit crawls about and soils what it gnaws. Once they thought of becoming heroes, now they are voluptuaries. The hero is for them an offense and a fright. But by my love and hope I beseech you, do not throw away the hero in your soul. Hold holy your highest hope. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Thus spoke a madman. Andrew, try to play a bit more quickly than the last time we played. What do you mean? The conference in Bangkok 15 years ago. You remember that? I remember it took you so long to make one move I finally lost patience and forfeited the game. What mattered to me most was not whether Nietzsche was right or fair or wise in everything he said, but that he took everything he said from the bottom of himself and did the best he could with it. Did his best, in other words, with all that is in fact not right and fair and wise and yet is so much a part of the human condition. Of course I was aware that numerous other philosophers also examined this allegedly negative, all too negative side of things. But the difference between them and Nietzsche struck me forcibly in that the former immediately marked it off and exempted themselves from it. I was thinking, why hasn't anyone ever written a play about him? I saw a play about him, Andrew. It was a short piece in the university theater when I was an undergraduate. My sister's fiancé, believe it or not, played Nietzsche. Is that right? Yes, and did a wonderful job. In fact, he received a standing ovation. Can you tell me something about this play? It was a one-man show portraying him after his breakdown and reflecting on his dubious intellectual heritage. Nietzsche's one-man polemical show largely concerned with pulling down the britches of traditional philosophy and giving it a good caning reinterpreted as inflammatory talk that had historical consequences for which he should be held responsible. Perhaps this was the sort of thought that eventually came to me and allowed me to take him up without reserve and with a growing admiration of his searching for the truth without the customary philosophical reservation. The good-evil opposition was the thing already falling in me that Nietzsche gave the final push to. It simply no longer made sense to take seriously other philosophers and the vast majority of people when they treated this opposition as if it were grounded right into the very heart of being. At least it no longer made sense unless one considered what made practical sense for most human beings to be the measure of what all life should be in its uttermost reach. But the thought of all life taking on the form of the thinking and acting philosopher with his perfecting of practical wisdom disguised most often as objective knowledge and theory was an absurdity that, as it seemed to me, everyone knew in their heart of hearts but kneeled down to as the social good. To simplify to this point, to turn all life into one pattern, order, way of thinking, being, acting, feeling, imagining, and so on, what did Nietzsche show but that this was death and that life was this massive and manifold doctrine called the good only as a part of everything that was also life and that played into, around, beyond, and even against it. You see this chessboard, Andrew? What would happen if we just ignored the rules? I took Nietzsche to be one who was cruel to that compact majority whose cruelty largely consists of shunning or persecuting or condemning those who don't go along with it by taking too seriously, that is, too radically, too noisily, or too performatively, some of its most cherished principles. The hyperbolical element in Nietzsche was more than matched by the hypocritical element of the compact majority, its firm declarations on the side of the good and the true coming as its various members found ways to dilute or circumvent these ideals precisely when they became menacing as ideals. Suppose the truth was terrible and suppose evil wrought good, was the compact majority even interested in looking into this? Was not their whole attitude to pretend that it didn't even exist as a question? And when someone finally came along who took the true and the good to be one in the most personal and heart-searching, one might even say, heart-wrenching, way, who at the same time cast his glance over what everyone else had been saying and was still saying about these matters, was he not one who was condemning himself in advance to be thrown out of the company of true believers? Was he not one who was forced to turn himself into a kind of pariah or apostate angel, malignant, rebellious, resentful, and scornful of those who dared to look only so far as they smelled no danger in it? It's your move, Theo. Nazi propaganda made us out to be like vermin. Millions slaughtered. Amongst them my grandfather and 2 aunts. As a reader of Nietzsche searching out and impressed by his extraordinary integrity, I no doubt became his apologist in the face of that post-Holocaust consciousness both in and around me. So it was that I saw Nietzsche being forced to write, as everyone must do, both for and out of his time, despite the fact that he also wrote against it, and, as a consequence, with the advantages and disadvantages that come from being both somewhat blind and oblivious to the future. Advantages such as being able to speak more freely and openly and uninhibitedly, not to mention insightfully, about evil than anyone before him. Such as being able to look to the future with an almost exclusively eschatological, but definitely anti-Christian, concern. And such as being able to do both these things with a good conscience and so do what otherwise he never would have done. Disadvantages, that he ultimately underrated and undervalued what he himself waged war against, the systematizing, ordering, and machine-like character of society. Its capacity for exorbitant growth and its power to assimilate the most heterogeneous elements. Instead of a chair devoted to the study of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there was Rosenberg's use of him. In short, Nietzsche's exposé suffered from having little or no internal check on its most dangerous and demonic aspect that would have been in keeping with the humanistic values to which it itself was inevitably indebted. I suppose the way he treats us, Prof stuck on sticks here to play Punch and Judy for him, represents humanistic values. Stefan Zweig describes Nietzsche's thought as starting old and growing younger. Wasn't there something like this in me when, after 7 years away from university studies, I came back to them? The self-flattering aspect that is inherent in affirming this discomforts me enough that I have to admit it alongside my dread of aging. Stiffness. Love of law, order, safety, protection, comfort. Loss of the adventurer's spirit. A growing cowardliness and lack of candor that seem to be inherent to fulfilling one's professional duties and responsibilities. Unctuousness. Lack of zest, spontaneity, and good feeling. All these elements I have always associated with getting older, and only an imaginative view of myself as some prodigious exception has prevented me from being overwhelmed with nausea. I don't believe this. You've got me checkmated. On Truthtelling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 28. The Return. When I made the decision to abandon my playwriting efforts and return to university, it was with the feeling that I was being true to Nietzsche's spirit even while, ironically enough, taking a direction roughly the reverse of his. Between the critical point in his life where, at age 34, he quit his post as a professor of philology at Basel University to go off into the scholarly wilderness, and the critical point in mine where, at age 40, I signed up as a full-time honors student in English literature and philosophy, there was no difference that I could detect in the one area that mattered most to me. How was I to push my free-spiritedness as far as it would go if I didn't take on academia? How was I to turn my serpents into dragons, to use Nietzsche's recipe for becoming a hero, if I didn't take my disquietude and disagreement to a higher level? One thing I'm thankful for in this life is that I've been able to get around and see a fair bit of the world. Different customs, different peoples. Makes one appreciate what one has here. You've always been a globetrotter. I remember in particular that time you went to South Africa. Yes, apartheid was starting to fall apart and my wife's relatives were caught in the thick of it. I remember you told me some of their fields were burned. As well as their barn, Andrew. All that happened only 5 days after we'd left them and gone to Israel. How lucky you were to get out of there before all that happened. We wanted them to leave but they refused. They insisted they had to see it through. It's terrible what hatred and prejudice can do. These kind of people, Andrew, are not to be found anywhere. They were willing to die. Oh, Andrew, can you believe it? Some of their children go into the homes of the very families that, with white hoods and brandishing torches, came to their home in the middle of the night and, with the most abject cowardliness and ruthless display of force, denounced them as traitors for doing what was right. Besides the fact that my return to the university corresponded with the end of my being able to call myself a playwright and, more properly, an aspiring one, a static position over 13 years but at least it offered some status, there was also the fact that it came at a time when I could no longer call myself a construction worker. Shortly following the deaths of my sister and my father was the death of the company I had worked for 16 years. I wasn't tempted to go to work for any of the rival companies because I had already heard enough about their shoddy practices. After a few meager attempts to find comparable or altogether different work, I ended up being satisfied with driving taxi full-time. But of course were it not for the fact that I viewed it as a transitional affair, a means to an end, an ongoing expression of my errancy, I would have been hard put to bear the stigma of lowliness and lack of ambition attached to it. Leroux brings up the oddest things. What now, Andrew? Well, the other day, he mentioned that university profs are far down on the list of professionals respected by the public. So now my whole bent was to go up the academic ladder as a student and only as a student as far as I could. To go up it without losing myself in the process and so without having any concrete or definite plan to capitalize on. Looking ahead, I saw a doctoral degree coming to me in about 10 years if all went well. I saw a long voyage and adventure that, though I might end up shipwrecked, would at least fill my sails with the highest level of interest and satisfaction. And, finally, I saw myself vaguely bringing all to maturity in one massive creative effort. It's time for the new game, Andrew. Perhaps at this point I should make first mention of a matter that I will no doubt have to expound upon more fully later. It pertains to what could be called a performative contradiction, an ironic instability and weakness right at the heart of one's greatest show of strength and courage. It also pertains to what a good citizen could bring against a free spirit in the way of charging him with his own form of hypocrisy. In this I'm reminded of a university professor who, speaking some years ago at a conference in commemoration of Nietzsche, took umbrage at the fact that he quit the university so early and no longer earning a living for himself like most capable and responsible people, was satisfied to live off the small pension he received. At the time I thought her comment was petty and lowbrow but, with the considerations that now come to me, I can see that what she perceived as an element of freeloading and abuse, as an economic dependence on the system sharply at odds with a destructive critique of it, is a bind that leaves the door open to someone like her accusing someone like Nietzsche of living in a glass house. And so must I qualify my own situation for, living in a society that provided for me when, on a couple of occasions, I was unemployed or injured, that allowed me to seek out a higher education at a university, that loaned me significant sums of money when I decided to prolong it. I was subject to bringing into my condition an element of freeloading and abuse even though, for the longest time, I prided myself on not doing so. You and I, Andrew, have been strapped to our responsibilities many a time when we would have liked to have chucked them. We've had to accept the grueling and unpleasant parts of the job so that everyone could get what they came here for. Once I had decided to pursue graduate studies, it was pretty clear to me that I was going to be shifting my attention from the literary to the philosophical. At least so I viewed the matter as a formal or systematic undertaking that would provide me with the greatest challenge and the most comprehensive grasp of the Western tradition. For this reason as well as for a couple of others, the thought of pursuing graduate studies in English literature as an ever deeper involvement with literary theory and criticism left me cold. On the one hand, I had a limited interest in this field apart from what I myself did in it. On the other, it brought me too close to where I had failed and, as a consequence, it inevitably registered with me as a kind of yielding or surrender. A being satisfied with second best, with no longer trying to attain the heights. I'm sure I would have got nowhere. Then where would I have been? Where would I be now? As an actor, I mean. After all, it's only a very few that get to the top. And so for the rest, well, it's precarious. Good for perhaps one's early and middle years, but then, with old age, what does one end up doing? Working as a dispatcher for a cab company. What are you bringing this up for? I don't know. It just popped into my head. You've been a professor for 30 years. You've done a wonderful job. I've been thinking, Andrew. I'm going to tell those two know-it-alls when I see them again that your teaching methods, though they of course differ from mine, are impeccable. I could have speeded things up for myself. I could have got my honors degree in 1 year instead of 2. But then I would have had to choose between specializing either in English literature or in philosophy. With my graduate studies still ahead of me, I decided to specialize in both subjects. My only reason for doing so was that, just as had been the case in the past, I was committed to making my university studies as pleasurable and as interesting as possible. Was für ein Zug ist das. It was with no shortage of confidence and enthusiasm then that I rode into the university just about the time that a relatively new current of thought had ensconced itself there. Feminism, of course, had been in the air for quite some time. But between 1984 and 1991, the period I was away from the university, it had definitely intensified and infiltrated the institution in a much more noticeable and even obtrusive way. I disliked it for a number of reasons that issued as much from prejudice as perspicacity. In order to sum up the matter as best as I can, I feel obliged to say that just as I felt somewhat vulnerable to it, so I felt its own vulnerability. The human all too human in me was simply the human all too human in it from a different angle. And what was this human all too human if not idealism mixed with the will to power? On the one side, the will to equity or equality in an already ascending and largely privileged group. On the other, a will to truthfulness in a person already ensconced in a traditionally masculine and even hypermasculine identity. What was my view of myself if not one that was instinctively a separation from an elevation above the other? And what in effect was my vulnerability if, as was the case, I had included in that other the mass of men and their middle-class values? Andrew, we all have egos just as we all have bodies. And just as out of modesty and respect for others damn it, you did it again. How is that possible? You're only in check, Theo. Only in check, he says. Theo, calm down. As far as I can see, you can still move my queen. And then what? Your bishop will take her. Well, then try protecting your king with your. Don't tell me how to play the game. I'll figure it out. Let's see, no, that won't work. I'll lose my bishop to yours. Then if I move my rook to the corner, I'll get eaten by your queen. God almighty, Andrew, do you think it's fair to play like this? What do you mean? Letting me think you haven't got a chance of winning and then playing like fucking Kasparov.